Good day. So in this lesson, we will be talking about independent and dependent sources. We have learned that the basic elements in a circuit can be composed of active and passive elements. For active elements, it is generally the sources such as the voltage source or current source. We already learned how to decompose a complicated circuit using the series parallel and Y delta transformation. We also learned how to use the KCL and KBL. However, so far, we only used what we call the independent sources. So in this particular lesson, we will be exploring the another type of source, which is the dependent source. Let's begin. So for independent sources, we are already introduced with the voltage sources. Those sources are actually ideal sources. When we say ideal sources, are sources that does not have what we call the internal resistance. So we also have what we call the current sources. Ang symbol niya ay syempre bilog with an arrow. So the arrow in the source signifies the direction of the current. So however, both of them are ideal sources. If we are to look into what we call the actual voltage and current sources, we have to introduce what we call the internal resistance. For voltage sources, it should be in series with our voltage source. On the other hand, for your current, it should be in parallel. So this small letter r is what we call the internal resistances of our voltage sources. So that is basically the independent sources. So we have a voltage source, whether it is ideal or actual, and we also have a current source, again with or without internal resistance. Now, we are interested in looking at dependent sources. So dependent sources can also be voltage dependent. When you say voltage dependent, we mean that the value of the source, whether it's voltage or current, is dependent on a particular voltage value. Similarly, it could be a current dependent. Let's explore more about it. There are several types of dependent sources depending on whether it is voltage or current source, to which parameter it is dependent on. So let's start with number one. We call it the voltage dependent voltage source. Voltage dependent voltage source, which we call VDVS, is basically a voltage source. Since voltage source siya, we will use the plus or minus as a symbol. By the way, take note that for dependent sources, we will not use circle as the symbol or the sources. Rather, we will be using diamond. The diamond signifies that it is dependent to a certain parameter. So in this case, it is a voltage source which is dependent on a voltage. That's why it's called a voltage-dependent voltage source. For example, we can say that it is 2Vx. So when we say 2Vx, it means that the value that that particular source produces is dependent on the value of Vx. So since Vx is a voltage, we call it a voltage-dependent voltage source. So in this case, since nakalagay 2Vx, it means it is 2 times whatever the value of Vx is. So if Vx changes, the value of this particular source will also change. Kaya hindi siya independent kasi depende sa kung saan ang value ng Vx, doon nakadepende yung magiging value ng ating dependent source. Similarly, we can also have what we call the voltage-dependent current source. In this particular case, it is of course a current source. So since current source siya, diamond ulit ang gagamitin ng symbol kaya dependent siya, and we have an arrow. The arrow signifies the direction of the current. Ang dependence nito is in the voltage in the part of a circuit natin. So within the circuit siya. In this case, for example, we have the value as 10Vx. We have to take note here that though 10Vx siya, the current source produces amperes. Therefore, the unit is still in amperes, though dependent siya sa isang voltage source. It simply means that whatever the value of the Vx, you multiply it by 10, and that is the amount of current in amperes that this particular source produces. We will look into another one. We have now the current dependence. So the current dependent voltage source, CDVS, it is voltage source whose value is dependent on a current value within the circuit. So since it is a current dependent voltage source, again, diamond ang ating gagamitin, the value na will be dependent of parameter within the circuit that is a current. So in this case, we have the 2Ix. The 2Ix means that the voltage value of this particular source will be twice or 2 times whatever the value of Ix is. So Ix is a current, therefore it is a current dependent voltage source. Value is dependent on current, which is an Ix. Let's continue. For number 4 type of source, we have the current dependent current source. So CDCS. In this particular case, it is a current source whose value is dependent on a value of current within the circuit. So again, diamond siya. So we will notice that it is 2Ix. So ibig sabihin ng 2Ix is ang value nitong particular element na to or source na ito is twice of whatever the value of Ix is. So the summary of this particular discussion is that we have 2 types. We have the independent and we have the dependent. So for independent, we only have 2, the voltage and the current source. And for the dependent, we have 4, the voltage dependent, which can also be divided into 2, the voltage source and the current source. An acronym niya is the VD, VS, and the VDCS. So another one is the current dependent. It can be either voltage source or current source. So it is CDVS and the CDCS. Let's look for an illustration that will show this particular concept. So I'm drawing now a circuit with several type of voltage and current sources, and we will try to identify what type of sources are they, and if they are dependent, saan sila nakadepende na parameter. Let's consider this one. So the 10 volts here na sa unahan, makikita natin that it is an independent, no? So it is an independent voltage source. It is independent because we can see that the symbol is not diamond. Therefore, it is independent voltage source. Another is the Vx/3, which is a current source, but since diamond ang symbol niya, it means it is a dependent. Saan siya dependent? Dependent siya sa Vx, di ba? So ang value niya is Vx/3. So therefore, it is what we call the voltage-dependent current source. It is a current source that is dependent on a voltage, which is the Vx. So asan niyang Vx na yan? So we can observe that in our 1 ohm resistor on the right side of our element. Ayan. Sa natin na kung anong value ng Vx na yan, divide mo siya sa 3, that will be the value of the current output of that particular dependent source. Another one is what we call the 5 ampere current source. It is bilog ang kanyang ang symbol. So therefore, it is an independent current source. Walang problema. 5 amps lang ang output niya. So another one is what we call the 2Ix here, which is though siya ay nakalagay 2Ix, it is a voltage source kasi plus or minus siya. And dependent siya kasi diamond ang ating symbol. So we call it current-dependent voltage source. Current-dependent voltage source siya kasi ang value niya is 2Ix. So, asan yung Ix na yan? We can see that, again, on the 1 ohm resistor dito sa left side natin. So, therefore, we have seen in this example that we can have several types of voltages and current sources within your single circuit. The key is to identify whether it is independent or dependent. If it is dependent, onto which parameter it is dependent. Now, let's proceed to an example involving dependent sources. For example, we have here a circuit, a simple circuit with 2 sources, an 36 volt and a 5 IO voltage source. So we are to look for the value of the IO. So we can observe that the IO is the current that passing through the 4 ohm resistance. At the same time, it is the value to which the 5 IO voltage source is dependent from. So simple lang, since it is single loop system, we just have to consider one loop, say loop IA. And we can also have, for purposes of illustration, let's call V1 yung voltage across the 4 ohm. The solution is to simply apply the KVL at loop A. So we can start with 36 volts. 36 minus V1 minus 5 IO equals 0. So nakikita naman natin yan dyan. But since V1 can be simplified using what we call the value of your Ohm's law, we have the V1 is actually equal to 4 IO. So we just substitute that. And then we can have it as 36 minus 4 IO minus 5 IO. Simplify further. 36 minus 9 IO equals 0. And then IO equals 36 over 9 is equal to 4 ampere. So therefore, IO is simply 4 ampere. So 2 principles ang ginamit natin dito, guys. First, we use the KVL. Second, we use the Ohm's law to substitute the value for V1 and solve for our IO. I hope you understand. It's a simple KVL and Ohm's law. Let's have another example, a more complicated one. For example number 2, we are to find the value of VO in the circuit shown and the power dissipated in the controlled source, which is in this case, that is the one with 2 VO. Required not the value of the VO. The VO is the voltage drop in the 4 ohm resistance, as well as the power dissipated in the 2 VO. So let's start. We can observe that in this particular circuit, meron tayong what we call the loops that we can identify. But let's first call the current flowing sa 4 ohm and the 6 ohm as I. And then we will try to apply KCL here. We just need to identify the nodes, so A and B. So we apply KCL at node A. Bakit KCL ang pinili natin? Because we can observe that most of them are current source. So meron kayong IO dito, and meron tayong 10 amps, and we have 2 VO. So we just have to use KCL. So lahat sila papasok, so lahat sila positive, and we equate that to 0. So yan ang ating first equation. However, we don't need the IO, but we need the VO. So we can now have a relationship between IO and VO using Ohm's law again. So VO is simply equal to 4IO. So ibig sabihin, sorry, nakat na tayo dyan. We can see here that IO is actually equal to VO over 4. So we just have to substitute that to our equation. So we have VO over 4 plus 10 plus 2VO equals 0. Since pareho sila may VO, we just combine them. So 4 times 2 equals 8 plus 1 is 9. So that is 9 over 4. 9 over 4 VO plus 10. So ilipat natin, so minus 10 na siya. And in solving for VO, we can say that VO is simply equal to 4.44 volts. So 4.44 volts ang value ng ating VO. Now we will go to question letter B. We are to solve for power at the controlled current source, which is the 2 VO na nakikita natin sa right-hand most part of our screen. Since it is 2 VO, it's a current source. If we use the power is equals to VI, we have to have a value of V. But we can observe that the value of V, or the voltage across 2 VO, is actually VAB. So we can say that VAB times 2 VO, that is actually the power. The problem is that we don't know the value of VAB. So anong gagawin natin? Ang gagawin natin is that we have to first use KVL in order for us to solve for VAB. We can observe that VAB is the voltage across the 10 amps. So using KVL involving the 6 ohm and the 4 ohm resistances, therefore we can create a loop A, and then that particular loop will generate an equation that we can use. So therefore we can say that 6 negative 6 IO minus VO minus VAB is equal to 0. So VAB therefore is equal to negative 6 times, what is the value of IO? VO over 4. We established that kanina. Minus your VO. Solving for VO, then therefore we can say that it is equal to negative 10 over 4 VO. Substituting the value of VO, then we can have a final answer for VAB, which is equal to 11.11 volts. So that's the value of VAB. Now we just have to substitute that back to the formula for powers. We can now solve for the power. P is equals to VAB times 2V. So we just have to substitute the value. We have 11.11 volts times 2 minus 4.44. The value will be negative 98.77 watts. So I disregarded the negative because the negative only tells us that the value or the power is being absorbed rather than being produced. So this is the concept of this. So we have now the power, which is equal to 98.77. So we just have to treat the dependent sources as another parameter within the equation and just relate it to whatever variables it is related to or dependent to. So that is the concept of using the voltage and current dependent sources in a circuit. And thank you so much, guys, and I hope you have learned something. Goodbye.